Hello everyone, the day has come and I have finally started building the roof on my house. In this video I'll talk about the rafter system and laying the gable. For your convenience there are timestamps in the video, but I recommend watching the whole thing. The next stage in building the house was supposed to be laying the gable. To lay the gable I first had to cut off the protruding part of the block above the reinforced belt and then even it out with a float. Using a laser level, I stretched a string and laid the masonry along it. The first row of the gable masonry was laid on the reinforced belt, so I used a cement sand mortar for it. The following rows of the gable masonry were done with foam adhesive. Including an attic during construction changed how many aerated concrete blocks were needed, so I ran out of blocks. The work took place during a challenging period due to high prices and limited availability of building materials. Buying D300 aerated concrete blocks was nearly impossible since factories didn't have them. Basically, at that time we had to order D400 aerated concrete blocks, and even those had to be waited for 2 weeks, so we had to postpone work on the gable and start preparing for the installation of the rafters. Fortunately for the porches and terraces, it was necessary to provide a platform for supporting the posts of the porch terrace. In the original design of the Z7 house, the foundation for the post is monolithic, with a depth below the frost line. I considered this irrational and made everything much simpler. I dug holes half a meter deep, because digging a narrow hole deeper than 1 meter 20 is almost impossible. I filled the holes with crushed stone up to 30 centimeters, compacting each layer with my feet. Then I made a permanent formwork from leftover expanded polystyrene, and from leftover rebar I made small frames. I mixed the mortar in a bucket with a hammer drill and poured it into the resulting containers, gradually adding crushed stone as I poured. The concrete layer ended up being about another 30 centimeters high. In theory, frost heaving of the soil can reach up to 12%, which means that if the ground freezes to a depth of, say, 1 meter, there could be up to 12 centimeters of uplift. In reality, on loam in the central region, heaving is usually about 5 to 7 centimeters, and I don't need to completely eliminate heaving in this spot. The goal is to shrink it to a few centimeters. Crushed stone and extruded polystyrene, which I'll also add around the perimeter, will handle this perfectly, since all of this will be hidden under the porch and terrace anyway. I installed the posts on these screw plates so that I can adjust the height during the operation of the house, and also just for convenience during the installation of the posts. It's more convenient this way. Once the concrete gained enough strength, I drilled a hole with a hammer drill and drove in 10 mm more anchors. Briefly about what it's like when you have no experience. I had never drilled before in my life, and as a result, my drill bit turned from this into this. And it broke my concrete piece, because it turned into some kind of mess, and I guess I overheated the drill bit. And on top of that, the drill bits themselves are made of plasticine, so this little thing got dull and started breaking everything instead of drilling. And of course, my hands, as always, are golden. As supports, I used a beam. At the bottom of the beam, I made a hole with a 25 mm diameter to set it onto the support plates. If the holes are made straight, the beam fits in without any problems. I drilled it straight. On the terrace above, I also used a 150 by 150 beam. And we had to lift all of this together as a team of 3 and temporarily fasten the structure to the Mauerlat on the porch. On top, there was already a sufficient cross-section of 100 by 150, and the span there was much smaller. Here, I managed to lift the beam by myself. I nailed the beam to the posts with 4 120mm nails on each side, and in a couple of places I also added brackets for height. I drilled the entire structure, adjusted the beam using screw jacks, and now I could start working on the roof. Initially, I planned to make a tension roof with hanging rafters, just like it was done in the old house on my property, but because of the small roof pitch angle, I thought, damn, I'm kind of nervous right now, you wonder if it'll work out. The snow load might be too high, and even though the online calculator said the roof wouldn't collapse, I still had doubts, hoping for a lucky outcome. I had some long scraps of the same laminated veneer lumber beam, and from them I could make purlins to support the rafters and get a roof without thrust, using layered rafters. With this setup, the roof becomes 146% more reliable, and the process of installing the rafters is simplified. But even with this kind of rafter system, working alone is almost masochistic, so for a couple of days my brother from 2 laminated veneer lumber beams came to help me. We made 2 shorter girders which will form the walls of the rooms in the future attic. We installed the girders so that the distance from the wall would be 1.5 meters in height, and from wall to wall it turned out to be a little over 4 meters. We installed the laminated veneer lumber girder with a cross-section of 55 by 90 on the posts. For the posts, I used boards of 50 by 150, and each of them rested on the floor beams. I had to order extra boards during the worst period for prices, and basically when there were problems with the availability of boards. That's why some of my boards were of the wrong cross-section, and for some posts I nailed together 2 100 by 25 boards. We temporarily secured the posts at the bottom with an angled bracket to prevent movement. Then we nailed everything with 100mm nails from 3 sides and removed the angle bracket, moving it up and nailing it as well, onto the ridge beam. I used a longer laminated veneer lumber beam, which was supposed to rest on the gables, but since the gables weren't there yet, I made temporary supports. The cross-section of the ridge beam turned out to be 90 by 120, with a length of almost 8 meters. This cross-section is not enough. That's why the support in the center will be permanent, and later on will form a partition between the rooms in the attic. When the beams were installed in their places, we started marking the rafters. For the rafters, I used boards measuring 50 by 200. We lifted the board up and placed it against the beams. I marked the notches on the rafters using a level. You can also make the markings using a bar with a thickness equal to the future notch. Both methods are convenient and simple, especially if you don't repeat my mistake and make sure the rafter touches both the end of the mauerlat and all the beams at the same time. Then you can cut the rafters. I wanted to use a template to save time and effort, so we made the notches on one marking board and lifted it back up to make sure the notches were correct. Here was my second mistake. I should have cut a couple of trial rafters, not just one. The rafter we cut as a template fit perfectly at every point. We tried it in all the spots on both sides of the house and everything was fine. That's why I thought it wasn't necessary to cut a second one, but, jumping ahead, I'll say that later, half of the cuts turned out to be in the wrong places. The boards have large deviations in their sizes. Therefore, to get an even roof surface later, we aligned the template rafter not by the side with the cut, but by the other end. Then, despite the difference in the sizes of the boards, we get an even roof surface on the side we need. I did most of the cutting with a circular saw, and then just finished it off with a handsaw.
In St. Petersburg, it's finally summer, plus 32 degrees. Work is literally boiling.
The sawn rafters received fire and bioprotection, while the boards were treated in a bath made from aerated concrete blocks and plastic film. It wouldn't hurt to remind you once again to protect yourself and at least use gloves and safety glasses. with the end. First,
we leaned it, closed the door, and didn't get anything in our eyes.
we quickly rinsed my brother's eye and he wasn't hurt, but his hand got burned and the toenail on his foot was completely eaten away. So be careful, take care of yourself and your health. We lifted the finished rafters up for convenience, raising them to one side from inside the house and to the other side from outside the house. When we lifted and set up the rafters, I saw that the notches turned out to be messed up. But my brother had to leave, and it didn't seem possible for him to redo everything alone. I decided to leave everything as it is. I'll explain later why I was alone. I had already set the rafters more precisely, with the right spacing. The spacing turned out a bit odd. Since I'm planning to install skylight windows, the spacing between the rafters needs to be 5-6 cm wider than the window size, which in my case will be 80 cm wide. There won't be any problems with insulation, since I'll be using mineral wool in rolls that are 1.2 meters wide, and it can be conveniently cut to fit any spacing. I temporarily fixed the rafters with brackets, just so they wouldn't be blown away by the wind, and after installing the rafters, it became inconvenient to use the stairs. As noted in the previous video's comments, it would have been better to turn the temporary stairs the other way. So I unscrewed the stairs and turned the base around. Secured it with screws to the floor beams and additionally braced it with a crossbar between the beams. Now it became convenient to carry blocks up the stairs, and I could continue laying the gables on the gable. I had to order additional D400 blocks instead of D300, which the whole house is made of. D400 no longer meets the thermal engineering requirements. But that's how things turned out. I won't go into details. This decision was carefully considered and chosen as the lesser of two evils. I hope it will improve the situation at least a little. It would have been better to plaster the whole gable with warm plaster and finish it with planking all at once during the construction process, but it turned out that when the masonry reached the ridge beam, I prepared the place where the beam would rest on the block and with some simple manipulations set the beam onto the block. Since it was my first time building gable masonry, I didn't do everything quite right. It would have been more convenient to mark the unglued block, cut the necessary edge diagonally, and only then glue the block in its place. But I thought I would cut it along the rafters later, and as a result I struggled with cutting for several days because it was extremely inconvenient. I made things much harder for myself. I used a knife. It turned out that it tends to run out, and I spent the whole day cursing the gable. And why the heck wouldn't it cut, damn it? I just needed to buy a new handsaw, and things would have gone much faster. I didn't really try to cut everything perfectly straight, because everything would be covered by the gable overhangs anyway. Then I had to rack my brain about how to make such beautiful gable overhangs. Most people just have them like this, on the battens, which really spoils the appearance of the house. To make everything look nice, Christian came. The solution was that we needed cantilevered rafters, pre-assembled in a step-like pattern. For this, I had to make a 50 by 150 board again by joining two 2-inch boards together, and then I screwed another 100 by 25 board to the bottom as a reinforcement. To secure the cantilevered rafters, I made brackets that extended 60 centimeters beyond the gable. In the outermost rafter, I didn't make a notch and nailed the bracket to the end of the second rafter. The cantilevered rafters turned out to be extremely heavy, plus we had to reach far beyond the walls, so we had to secure them, the three of us. We screwed plates in the places where the bracket was supposed to be, grabbed the plate by hand, and the three of us carefully hung the cantilevered rafter onto the plates that were screwed to the brackets. Then we could align everything and nail the rafter to the end of the bracket and remove the plates. I also fastened the joints of 2 rafters with a metal plate and wooden overlays, an unexpected crash test for the screwdriver. There's an emergency, everything fell off the roof. The bearing got smashed, unfortunately, but it's even trying to work. Despite the help of friends with the construction, I spent 94% of the time working alone. It's very hard, and you start to fall apart, and that's why, so I don't fall apart, I take a bunch of supplements. Since my brother is a doctor, I take them under his supervision. I take inositol to stay energetic and active, omega-3 fatty acids to keep my brain working well, and vitamin D3. Because everyone who lives in St. Petersburg has a vitamin D3 deficiency. Zinc is a really good thing for men, and I take regular multivitamins to make sure my body has everything it needs for immunity. Now it's time to securely fasten all the main rafters. I've seen roofs flying around our city. That's why I decided to play it safe with the rafter fastenings and nailed each rafter at the very bottom with 3 120mm nails, and on the Mauerlat I used 2 120mm nails each, and also to the ridge beam. I also nailed them on the porch, terrace, and on the Mauerlat. And on each rafter I additionally installed 2 large brackets, which I first fixed with screws and then thoroughly nailed as well. To compensate for the poor cut at the top near the ridge beam, I nailed 250 by 150mm board overlays to each rafter. I also nailed the overlays to the beam. This increased the rafter's bearing area on the beam and interlocked the rafters. But on this side, you can't secure the overlay. I nailed a metal plate in the spots with bad cuts near the Mauerlat, and a bit later I nailed the support bar. Spider-Man Blick. So, even despite my clumsy workmanship, the roof ended up with minimal spreading load. And the roof won't want to slide down since it has a large support area on the terrace beam, porch beam, wall plate and purlins. And I don't even know how strong the wind would have to be. To tear it off, you would also need to nail crossbars near the wall plate between all the rafters, a so-called support board, so that the future attic insulation doesn't fall out onto the street. I nailed one side straight into the end and the other at an angle. There are still 4 more spots like this between the wall and rafter. Here I'll just set the block on foam, and I also missed a bit with the porch terrace supports. Ideally they should have been poured with the blind area and closer to the house, and then a 6-meter board would have been just enough for the long rafters. But I was literally 15 centimeters short, so to extend them I had to nail extensions to the rafters. Fortunately, everything with the extensions turned out to be simple. I took the cutoffs from the short rafters, which were already cut at the right angle, made a notch in them, and nailed the extensions in place. Next, I could start working on the membrane and the battens, which I'll talk about in the next video. I'll detail all the roofing expenses once the roof is completely covered. So, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss it. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. Wishing you all the best and see you next time. Booze, wow.